This picture, my best friend told me this picture looks like I'd love to be your Century 21 agent. Yeah, I don't know where y'all stole that picture from. Did I turn that one in? Oh, Lord. Well, there are other ones you could have chosen off Facebook, so I'm glad you chose this one. Some of my Fat Booth pictures. Do you have the Fat Booth app on your iPhone? You got to check it out. Take your picture and you can make people a lot bigger. My son loves that. All right. This presentation began 4 years ago in Phoenix at MinistryCom 2006. I was sitting there. I actually met Terrell, believe it or not, my first week on the job. I don't know if he'll remember that or not, but I started in this role at First Baptist on February 6th, 2006. And I got there, I showed up to work, and somewhere, kind of getting the lay of the land. Now, I'd been a member of the church since '98, so I knew the church. But I'm kind of getting the lay of the land of what's happening in our church, what's going on, and kind of really getting to understand it behind the scenes. And there I am on a Monday, and I see that, wow, there is a group called MinistryCom with some sort of regional conference for church communicators right downstairs this Thursday and Friday. What? God, thank you. Because I didn't have the first clue what I was doing when it came to ministry communications. And what do you know? I could walk right down to our beloved reception room and go to a 2-day conference with folks on ministry communication. So I found out about MinistryCom, went to the one in Phoenix, and really started asking a lot of questions. And we'll get to that in just a second. So, Jody, if we can get the ball rolling here. Why don't Houston Christians go to church? Now, if you're not from Houston, you probably don't care. Unless you are very, very kingdom-minded and you care about every Christian in every city in the United States. But that's not really what we're going to talk about today. What we're really going to talk about is the importance of knowing your audience and asking the right questions. And I've told Terrell and I told Evan how blessed I am that I can make this presentation a lot shorter today. Because as I've heard from each of our keynote speakers, as I've heard in several of our breakout sessions these last 2 days, people are talking about that. People are asking that question. When I attended MinistryCom in Phoenix in 2006, I walked out of there, a little agitated. Jody, if you can go ahead and move on forward. This is where the question came from. I sat at MinistryCom in 2006. There was great stuff. I soaked it all in. I learned a lot, but would it work for my church? First Baptist Church was founded in 1841. Now, if you know your American history or Texas history, that's during the 9 glorious years that Texas was its own nation. From 1836 to 1845, we were our own republic. So in 1841, our church was founded by, ready for this, foreign missionaries from America. Isn't that awesome? Who came to the Republic of Texas to found a church. And our pastor delivered the first sermon ever in Houston. We are not technically the first church, but our pastor was the first sermon ever delivered in Houston. Founded in 1841 by 17 members, half of whom were African American. Isn't that amazing, given that time in our country? 169 years old this year. Southern Baptist, large megachurch in a huge city in the Bible Belt, in a city surrounded by other churches. Would all these cool things I heard about at MinistryCom apply to me? They were great ideas for such and such community church in a part of the country who didn't have a lot of churches. But would it apply to my church? So, asked another question. I teamed up with local peers, shared the question, and raised more questions. But what can we impact as communicators? I've heard a lot of groups, just like MinistryCom nationally, there are a lot of local groups within different cities. We have one. It's got a long name. It's the Houston Coalition of Church Communicators, H3C, started by a member of who was on the communication staff at a Methodist church in town. So that group comes together every once in a while. Directors come together. We as all communicators come together. frequently for different gatherings, and it was in that network that I started raising that question. You know, we all learned great stuff. Many of us had been to Ministry Com, but what could we as communicators really impact? And so at a board meeting, we started to cast the vision. We hired the Barna Group, which we'll talk about today, and we raised the funds for this study. Because we realized that as communicators in a city like Houston, there's only so much we could do through a billboard. I'm not going to convert a Muslim through a billboard. I'm probably not going to entice an atheist to come to church through a radio spot, most likely. Can God do that? Yes. Don't hear me say that he can't. But realistically, within the world of communications, what can we do to impact our city? And anecdotally, we know there are a lot of folks in Houston who don't go to church who proclaim to be a follower of Jesus Christ. So we saw those somewhat as the low-hanging fruit, so to speak, in our city. There are millions of people in Houston who will not be going to heaven. Millions of them. And we've got evangelism teams and mission teams and churches doing amazing things to reach them all. But from a communicator standpoint, maybe we should aim at that low-hanging fruit. People who claim to be Christians, but they're not in church. They're not growing. They're not being discipled. Maybe they're not really believers because they've never made that profession of faith, accepting Christ as their Savior. So that began the journey of answering, why don't Houston Christians go to church? Let me tell you a little bit about Houston. It is the fourth largest city in the country. Watch out, Chicago. We're waiting for those 2010 census results to come in. It's considered by some standards the seventh most diverse city in the world based on nationalities, ethnicities, languages spoken. The city is pretty much a third when it comes to Black, Hispanic, and white. See the next point, there are 90-plus languages spoken within the Houston Independent School District. You look at all the students and the homes that they come from, 90 different languages. And there are over 300 known people groups within the city. So you can do foreign mission work and never leave the city of Houston city limits. Now, spiritually, what about the city? Well, let's look at that. It is home to 30-plus mega churches. I believe it's the Hartford Institute up on the East Coast that tracks and studies mega churches. And at last count, there were somewhere between 30 and 40 mega churches by their standards within Houston. Now, I think they define it as an attendance of 2,000 and above, and I think they probably need to readjust their standards for a mega church, because I don't think it's that unusual these days to find churches of 2,000 and above weekly attendance. 3 of the top 10 largest churches based on the Outreach magazine list that just came out are in Houston. Lakewood Church being number 1 with around 45 or so in attendance, 45,000. Third place was Second Baptist Church with Ed Young Sr. and their 5 campuses. And 7th was the Fellowship of the Woodlands. I think now they just go by the Woodlands Church with Carrie Shook, and they have multiple campuses. There were 2 others in the top 100, but way down in like the 80s and 90s. And we were the 90th. We're very happy. Not that it's about size. Home to popular authors and TV ministries. Joel Osteen, Ed Young, Carrie Shook have very strong TV ministries. Nationally, internationally, locally TV ministries. Authors such as Beth Moore. And then we're home to 6 out of 10 of the fastest growing churches in the nation, again, based on that outreach list. You cannot drive down the street in Houston and not drive by a church, not see a billboard, not see a radio ad, see a TV ad, hear a radio spot. We're in the South. It's Texas. It's Houston. It's not like people aren't going to church because there's a lack of opportunity or awareness. So why the heck aren't Houston Christians going to church? And that's what we wanted to know. So we hired the Barna Group to conduct a study for us. And I'm just going to give you a little bit about the study, the semantic or the logistics of how it worked. But I want it to serve to you as an example of something perhaps that you can do when you walk out of this room and go back to your community. You may not be able to afford the Barna Group, but your denominational groups, local churches, maybe teaming up with a university, independent contractors who do some sort of demographic study, there are sources out there other than the Barna Group. Let me talk to you a little bit, though, about the study they actually did for us. They did telephone interviews, about 400 unchurched people. We told them to focus on people who are self-described Christians, and they have not been in church in 6 months. So we're looking at that kind of low-hanging fruit. Someone who says they're a self-described Christian, but they've never once set foot in the church, there's a bunch of different obstacles and barriers going on with that person that we may not be able to crack through simply as church communicators. And we didn't want them calling and talking to a Muslim or an active Jewish person, because really it's not the target here, okay? So that's our audience. And then the areas explored, we really had them look at a broad list of things. And as you look at that list, a lot of them, as we got into it, we really wanted to first talk about the different media habits they have, what sort of magazines are they reading, and things like that. But as we got into it more, we said, well, it's great to know what magazine they might read, or if they notice billboards, or if they like direct mail or not. But more important is, what should we tell them about? What's important to that demographic, that specific self-described Christian, hasn't been in church in 6 months? What's going on with them, okay? And so we asked a lot of questions about life priorities, biggest challenges, things like that, things that are going to touch their heart and get their attention, but also then some specifics about how would they like to hear about churches, what might appeal to them and get them to come, okay? So the results, the demographic profile, the average person in this range, a white female, around 50, married or cohabiting, without kids, completed 1 to 2 years of college. That's kind of the average. So it's more female, it's a little bit older, a little bit more upscale than the national average. What I found, or what I thought, when you hear about different techniques, different methods, different messages to send out, you hear so much of that is given in the context of national trends, national movements, so to speak. But this country is way too diverse. This country is way too diverse. And as I've heard several times these last 2 days, people mention, and I think it was Evan that talked about, God has given you a unique congregation. You are in a unique city. A lot of our cities look a lot the same. I was in a city last week in Indiana, and it looks a lot like this city right here. But the values are different. The customs are different. The relationship with the church in general might be different. And so the value of really understanding, and that's just right off the bat, the demographic profile for us is a little bit different than the national average of someone self-proclaimed Christian who hasn't been in church in 6 months. All right. So let me just show you one example that really, opened our eyes, okay? They were asked specifically, for those who have made a personal commitment to Jesus Christ, or have you made a personal commitment to Jesus Christ that is still important to your life today? National averages, you can see 45% said yes. Now this is among the people, self-proclaimed Christians, who have not been in church in 6 months. Of that group, nationwide, 45% yes, 55% no. In Houston, the numbers were remarkably different. So we've got folks who say that they are believers in Jesus Christ. They've not set foot in a church, but over 3/4 of them say they've made a personal commitment to Jesus that is still important today. Not they did it once when they were 7 and they walked the aisle because that's what they were supposed to do, but that is still important to them today. But they're not in church. Now, you can have a whole other 2-day conference on, well, do people really have to go to church? Okay, that's not this discussion. But there is something to be said, I hope, as church staff members, that connecting with that local body for growth, for service, for giving, for teaching, for living life with one another as the body of Christ coming together, there's something to that. So we're concerned. We got 75% of those folks, 78% saying it's still important today, but they're not here. The unchurched compared to the church. In the USA, typically there's a list. less interested in God, not so much interested in scriptures or faith, not really accepting of or interactive with the Bible, maybe a little hands-off toward the Bible. But in Houston, overall, we see that they're more interested across the board in all of those things. And I think that goes hand in hand with the fact that that population, 78%, still say that the decision they made to accept Jesus Christ is still important to them today. And so as the local Houston church, lowercase c, goes out to try to target, this low-hanging fruit of people who, for some reason, isn't in church, we got a lot of good things going for us, don't we? 78% say Jesus is still important to them today, their relationship. They're more interested in God than the national average, more interested in church, more interested in faith, more interested in the scriptures. Whew, right? We got our job easy. Now, going on to the next slide here, let me just tell you a little bit about when we presented these things. And this, I hope, will inspire you in some ways to pursue something like this for your community. This study was born really kind of as a moment, walking home from the ministry comm in 2006. Now here we are in 2010 telling you the results of it. Well, last year, 2009, we finally wrapped up the study and presented it, and our H3C group, our Coalition for Church Communicators, hosted an event. It was held at our church at First Baptist, and George Barna, there on the left, came in and presented the study. We nicknamed him George Barna himself because to distinguish him from the company, George Barna. We're like, well, George Barna himself is going to come. So that's became part of his name, George Barna himself. So there's George Barna himself. He came and present the results. It was such a blessing for us because we spread the word. We sent mail outs to local churches, had no idea what to expect. I mean, it's not like our group has powerful name recognition. What's this HC3? Who? What is that? Just inviting them to come. They had to pay. It was not cheap. I think it was around April over here was one of my teammates. I think it was around $80 or $70 or so. It wasn't cheap to come and just for a few hours hear the results of this study and get a copy of it. And we had over 280 people from throughout Houston and beyond. People came from counties away from Houston. I mean, it's in the title, Why Houston Christians Don't Go to Church. So I didn't feel bad. It's not like we duped them, but they came anyway. So whatever, you paid. Come on in. And it represented over 80 different churches and ministries. Radio stations came. Newspapers came. Some consulting firms came. The bishop for the Methodist Church in Texas, or that part of Texas, she was there. I mean, it was just a phenomenal moment when all these representatives from the kingdom doing kingdom work came together to learn, why aren't these Christians in Houston going to church? And to see them just eat up the data and just already kind of talking about, well, what can we do differently? What are we doing as a church that's missing the mark on this population? Okay, so let's talk about kind of what the takeaways were, the benefits. It sparked much examination, personal and corporate. Personally, just at our church, we held some follow-up meetings with staff members who attended. We had folks there who weren't just communicators, who attended the empty pews, is what we called it, our study, that conference with George Barna himself. It wasn't simply communicators that came to it. It was pastors. It was missions people. It was outreach people. It was communications people. It was women's coordinators and men's coordinators and youth workers. It was across the board. We didn't limit anybody to come. And so just hearing that conversation, I pulled in staff members from our church, and we kind of had a debrief about a lot of what the results said. And how does that impact what we do programmatically? How does it impact our communications? How does it impact, what are some things we're doing that are clearly out of sync with some things that George Barna found? And I would be lying if I told you that they all were like, that's awesome. Let's implement it all. Well, there are people on my staff who are just very quick to dismiss some of it, to be honest with you. They were really quick to dismiss some of the findings. I didn't think that it was really accurate. They really, they had anecdotal experience to say, But I've done this, what he's telling us not to do, and it worked like a charm. Great. Awesome. Do it. City of Houston, millions of people. Something's going to stick with everybody, at some point. Any method you try, something's going to stick. But looking at some of the big general trends and looking at some of the, just a different way to think about this population. Now, one of the things that they said over and over again in the study that Barna reported on, and actually this is what's a little frustrating, is I don't think it's documented in the study, but he talked about it a great deal. He talked about the unchurched not coming to church because they fail to see the value in it. They fail to see the value. So that gets to that whole topic of felt needs. Is there any reason for them to come? And April Canick, you want to wave, April? April over here is from one of the 7 churches who were the founding sponsors of the study. We had 7 churches kind of pony up money per church, and we had some supporting sponsors who chipped in a little as well, and she was from one of the founding sponsors of the study. She and I are board members on H3C, and it was kind of great because we got to see a little bit behind the scenes with George Barna himself before the seminar that afternoon, and he vented a little. He vented about his frustration with the American church and all the studying that's being done and all the reports that are being issued and all the trends that are being identified. But who's doing anything about them? And so it was really interesting, and it wasn't long, actually, until after his appearance there in Houston that he sold his part of the company. Still has his name on it, but he's really not as involved with it anymore. And so he kind of went off script some from the study and talking that day about really the church needing to step up and focus on what these people value. Not just these unchurched believers, but people in general, and focusing on, is there something in it for them? And so on this list of benefits, on shifting priorities and messaging, an example of that is, I can only speak from personal examples that we lived through. The year before this study, we had a conference on how to talk to your kids about sex. And it was a good turnout. People raved about it. People wanted us to post the audio file online afterwards, and all these were like, oh, grr, I'm so sorry I didn't go, because everybody was just raved about how great it was. And so then we go through this report, and I hear about talking to people's value, or getting something that people would value, and the importance, obviously, of kids and how people care about their kids. And is the church addressing anything that's really relevant today? And so this fall, when we had a similar presentation called Shaping Your Child's Sexual Character by the same presenters, we published the heck out of that thing. The last one, 2 years ago, we didn't promote externally at all. We promoted it a lot externally this time through Facebook ads and some other things, and the attendance went up. And so, looking at, here's a perfect example of something that's phenomenal for our members, and we could have a packed house just with our members. But hey, let's not keep our light hidden. And let's get it out there, because that's something this population is really going to latch on to. It inspired new programs, and it really broke down church barriers, or you see that on the screen, or at least chipped away at them. Through this study, we had, I'm looking at my list here, 3 Methodist churches, 2 Baptist churches, an Episcopal church, a Presbyterian church as the founding sponsors. And then supporting sponsors was a community church, a Methodist church, and the Texas Annual Conference of the United Methodist Church. So go Methodist. Y'all are chipping in big bucks. That's awesome. Woohoo. And to see them all come together in that chapel that day, and to hear those conversations, and to hear stories afterwards of conversations happening. And like I said, people came from counties away to come to this, and seeing and hearing them from different cities, different churches, talking about, well, now what do we do? And how can we work together on this? Excuse me. So how does this apply to you? Well, I wanted this slide to possibly just say, go figure it out. Because one thing that I think is I was talking to you earlier. She asked a question in one of the breakout sessions, and I was talking to her. What was your name?
Jylene.
Excuse me?
Jylene.
Jylene. I was talking to Jylene, and she is from Killeen, just down the road. Wow, that's like a Willie Nelson song or something, isn't it? Sorry. Yeah, well, you're welcome. Sorry for that. I was talking to her, and she was asking questions about, how do you propose some of these things that you learn here up against a church staff that may be older and set in its ways. And my advice to her was, it can be really tempting, and this is how I felt, and this is honestly how I was a little discouraged coming out of Ministry Common Phoenix. It can be really tempting to walk away thinking, man, if I'm not doing this cool thing and that cool thing and this technology and that technology, I'm irrelevant, I'm outdated, nobody in the community is going to look at me, our church is going to shut down, and we're all going to be unemployed. I felt like it was just a race to who can do the latest and coolest next thing. And I walked away with kind of this sense of this drive to put the technique, the method, the tool out first and force fit the message into it somehow. And how this applies to you, what I would say is, be good stewards of the position in which you've been placed. Be good stewards of the position in which you've been placed. Don't be good stewards of the latest online gimmick or gizmo or tool that you've downloaded. Be good stewards of your role in your church at this time in your community. Twitter may not be the right thing for your community. What? 4 years ago, Twitter didn't exist, I don't think, or at least I was not there yet. 4 years ago, I think back to a lot of the things that were just new and starting out. I'm like, my church wasn't there yet. I know that my church wasn't there yet. If you're a church that started, I've heard some people talk about their church being a little bit older because it's like 50 years old. I'm like, oh, you cute little things. Y'all are so precious with your 50-year-old churches. Some of you are still around, like your founding members are still there. If our founding members showed up, we'd freak out, right? Okay. And so be good stewards of where you've been placed in this time, in their community, with your pastor's vision. Your job is to support your pastor's vision. So be good stewards of that. Be a craftsman, which is, at the same time, not to contradict what I just said, but be a craftsman and know your tools. Know what works, know what doesn't work. Be men of Issachar. I'm not going to read it to you because it's 1 Chronicles. But in 1 Chronicles, it talks about the men of Issachar who understood the times and knew what was right for Israel to do. In that passage is a long list of people who were kind of almost like not a genealogy, but just kind of a report of all these men and tribes and folks who were there on the scene. And that's the only line where they describe the people group. And it said the men of Issachar who understood the times and knew what was right for Israel. Be those men and women who understood the times. And it may not be the national trend for your church. I was in a conference last week with a woman who has about a 300-member attendance at a small Presbyterian church in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Sister does not need a Twitter account. She doesn't need it. It's not right for her generation. The average generation of her church, it's not right, okay? And so understand what's right, and then be realistic. You're going to walk away from today with tons of ideas that you want to go and implement. Great. Take notes on them. Have them written down. Explore on your drive home, on your flight home. Think about them. I've been taking notes. As I'm taking notes, I've got a section of my Word document below where like follow-up ideas. I'm just vomiting ideas all over it. What percentage of those are going to come to fruition? I don't know. I got to vet them first. I got to go back and talk to my staff and figure out what really might work, what's really the right thing for us. I don't want to get caught up in the hype here, listening to what worked for churches in other parts of the country that do not reflect Houston, Texas, that are not right for a church of our size, of our denomination, of our theology, of our culture, of our pastor's vision, and so on. So be realistic, okay?